Welcome to the Wisconsin Podcast. I'm Craig Sauer. On this podcast, we talk Wisconsin things, everything from media, sports, culture, nature, politics, and more. Today's show focuses on the mysterious and elusive snowy owl. Every winter, a handful of snowy owls leave their nesting habitats in the Arctic Circle and reach Wisconsin. And they attract a lot of attention from birders and even people casually interested in wildlife. To learn more about snowy owls, how to find them, and to get the latest numbers on how many are showing up in Wisconsin this winter, I talked to Ryan Brady from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. He's a bird monitoring coordinator. Here's our chat. People are pretty entranced by these birds. Can you kind of describe what snowy owls look like and kind of what makes them unique?
Well, as the name would suggest, they're generally snowy white in appearance. They're larger than a crow, smaller than an eagle, standing a couple feet tall. Kind of a robust, stocky bird, not very slender or sleek. They have a round head that does not have the ear tufts you might associate with other owls. In general, they're mostly white. The males tend to be whiter than the females, and in general, the older birds tend to be whiter than the younger birds. So what that means is the oldest males tend to be almost pure white, whereas the youngest females have a lot of dark barring, kind of a very heavy salt and pepper kind of look to them, where maybe just the face is white. And those ones you might not think of as a snowy owl immediately when you see them, but ultimately that white face and then those bright yellow eyes looking back at you tend to tip you off. And then, of course, when they fly, the underwings are very white, and they show a bit more white than when they're perched. They have fully feathered feet, which helps keep them warm, but is also somewhat unique among the world of birds, where you typically see their legs exposed. So that's an adaptation to help keep them warm. The heaviest of all the owls that we have in North America, the females are on average larger than the males. Most of the males are down around the 3-4 pound range, whereas most of the females are 4.5 to 6 pounds, somewhere in there. And they're just kind of really a spectacular bird to see. And I think that, their appearance is one of the primary reasons why people do get excited to see them. Because we generally like white birds. We like swans. We like pelicans. We like egrets. And snowy owls are right up there among them.
And Wisconsin and most places in the United States are not the typical haunts for these owls. Where do they normally live?
Well, it depends on what time of year we're talking about, but most of the time, the majority of the snowy owls are in far northern North America. They're a bird of the tundra. They want big, open expanses without any trees, and so that's where they nest and raise their young, 1,000 to almost 2,000 miles north of Wisconsin. In the wintertime, some of them stay there, but a good number of them will move a little bit south. And in some years, a lot of them move south, and they can move quite a ways. Wisconsin gets a few every year. There's hardly a winter that goes by where we don't get a few snowy owls here in Wisconsin, and most of the northern tier of the U.S., especially North Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin. But then some years, we get these events called eruptions, and it's during these eruptions when a whole lot of owls move south, and we get a big influx into the northern half of the United States. And it can vary in numbers, the extent of the eruption. It can vary on exactly where kind of the epicenter, the heart of that eruption is. It might be along the eastern states in one year. It might be in the Midwest here another. It might even be farther west in some other years. But in those years, we can have hundreds of them around, whereas in a non-eruption year, we might only have a few handful. So their movements tend to really vary widely. And I think that's one of the things that kind of elevates the intrigue of them is the way that they're kind of unpredictable. I think if we had lots of snowy owls here in Wisconsin every year, we would take them for granted a little bit, maybe the way we do bald eagles or common loons or sandhill cranes. But it's that unpredictability and not knowing whether this year is going to be a good year or not for those snowy owls that really kind of lend a bit of intrigue to them.
What causes an eruption?
Well, that's $1 million question, to be honest. That's something that has been difficult to kind of tackle with certainty over the years. So the initial thought decades ago was that these snowy owls' prey sources up in Canada, which is particularly one type of rodent called a lemming, that those lemming populations crashed. So there were no lemmings around. That limited the amount of food available to these snowy owls, and so they really pushed south in search of food. And that's what kind of pervaded for decades, that sort of mentality. But recent evidence suggests something that's kind of the opposite, and that is that in some years the lemming populations are really, really high, and so there's lots of lemmings. Consider that lots of food out on the landscape. And in those years, these snowy owls are able to raise lots of young. So there's lots of food to feed their babies. A lot of babies survive. And then when those babies are large enough and start to take up a territory, they're outcompeted by the older birds on those territories, and they're forced to move south. And that's what brings them into Wisconsin. And so there's evidence in recent years, strong evidence, that it's that latter situation where it's temporary abundance of lemmings up in the Arctic allows snowy owls to raise lots of young, and then those young disperse southward during the winter months. That is really the hypothesis driving this. Now, it's possible both of those things happen. Maybe the lemming population crashes after all these young have been produced. But lemmings, as you might imagine, these small rodents in the Arctic are not really well known, not really well studied, and the way their population cycle isn't really well known. But it's the cycles of those lemmings that really dictate the movement patterns and the reproductive success of snowy owls. This year in particular, just as an example, the majority of the owls that we're seeing appear to be juvenile owls, so they're heavily barred individuals that appear to have been hatched this past summer. Well, that lends some credence to that hypothesis that it was a really good year for breeding up in the Arctic, and now we have all these young owls coming down. The same thing was evident back in our one of our last really major eruptions, which occurred in the winter of 2013-14, which also was dominated by juvenile birds. Now, in 2014-15, the following winter, we had what's kind of called an echo eruption. We had another eruption the year after this big one in 13-14. And in that second eruption, there weren't as many juveniles. There was a lot more birds that were consistent with those 2-year-old birds or even adult birds. And so even though that was a big eruption, it wasn't necessarily because there were a lot of juveniles that year. There was some other mechanism at play. So the take-home is their movement patterns in these eruptions are really heavily related to these lemming populations, which we don't understand really well. And there could be multiple mechanisms at place that really drive them here from one year to the next.
So are we experiencing another eruption this year?
Yeah, we definitely have an eruption this year. That is for sure. Last year, just as an example, by around this time, we had only about 25 snowy owls that were documented. And by the end of the winter, we had somewhere in the ballpark of 50. So far this year here in Wisconsin, we have over 200 presumed different individual snowy owls. So we have 8 times as many as we did last year so far. So that would definitely qualify as an eruption. It's hard to define an average year for seeing these critters in Wisconsin because their numbers vary so much. One year, like I said, it can be 25. The next year it can be 200. But typically, in an average year, you might have a few dozen or so. So we're well above that. In 2015-16, we had kind of a little mini eruption. We had, around this date, we had just over 100. And then, like I said, in 2013-14, and then again in 14-15, we had large eruptions here in the state. So this isn't without precedent. We're on track to have this event we're seeing right now, which is super exciting, is something that we did see as recently as 3 and 4 years ago. And in fact, there was another eruption that was quite large as well, almost as large as the one we're seeing now back in 2011-12. And that's already, in most folks, distant memories. But that's about 4 or 5 eruptions in the last, 8-9 years here in the state, which is unusual because typically these lemming populations cycle at 3 to 5 year intervals, and subsequently you get these snowy owl eruptions on that same interval, maybe every 4 or 5 years. But we have certainly seen that pattern play out a little differently within the past decade. And what that means is hard to say. On one hand, you could look at it as great. There's lots of reproductive success. There's lots of snowy owls out there. On the other hand, if those cycles of events occurring in the Arctic are kind of out of whack, maybe for some larger reason like climate change or other habitat factors, then that could be of concern.
You mentioned that a lot of the owls that come south are juveniles. Can you kind of explain, like, are they small? Are juveniles typically smaller than adult snowy owls, and are the ones that come south more typically male or female, or is there a mix?
Yeah, so good question. In most birds, not all birds, but most birds, including the snowy owl, the juveniles by this time of year they're full size. They look like adult birds. So you're not going to notice a size difference related to the age of the bird in the snowy owl, other owls, or most birds in general. What does differ in the snowy owl is their appearance. And it can be hard to really tell, especially to express this to the public who hasn't had a lot of experience, because frankly, it's hard even for experts in many cases to be able to tell the juveniles from the adults. Like I said, the juveniles tend to be more heavily barred, but there's overlap. You could have an adult female bird that's, say, 5 years old that has a similar amount and pattern of barring as, say, a male that was hatched just this past summer. So that complicates things. It definitely confounds your ability to assess it. What experts do is, and you wouldn't be able to do this unless you had a bird in hand or a really high-quality photograph of the bird flying, is they look for different age feathers. Birds replace their feathers, especially the big birds like this, one time per year. So if you have, and not all the feathers are replaced all at once. So you might have different age feathers on the bird that show different levels of wear. And so a more heavily worn feather will look more tattered. It'll be a little paler brown, not as black because it's been exposed to the sun and other environmental conditions. So those sorts of things are what the experts are looking for, those different age feathers in older birds, whereas in a juvenile bird, they haven't undergone that molt. They've left the nest with all the same age feathers, and therefore all their feathers are uniform and allow for that age assessment. But again, most people are not going to be able to look at a bird and be able to assess that. But just in kind of casual assessment from looking at photographs and other specimens and things, it appears now like most of the ones we're seeing this year are these juvenile birds, with some exceptions. Now, males versus females, what research has shown is that usually the males will disperse or travel more widely during the non-breeding season than females, and so they will often come farther south. So we tend to have a sex ratio that's skewed a little bit more towards males here at the southern edge of the range. Not strongly. We definitely have a good mix of males and females, but a little bit more towards the males. And the males tend to wander farther, mostly because if you think of it from a kind of a social dominance perspective, females kind of kick the males out. Females, like I said in the beginning, are larger, and by being larger, that affords them the opportunity to be dominant socially over the males and kind of stake a territory as their own. So a male's not going to mess with that bigger female, and he'll just move on for another territory. So that can drive a few more males to wander more widely than females, but females will also wander too. So we do have a mix of the sexes in any given year, not only in years when dominated by these juvenile birds, even in other winters as well.
So what do they eat when they come to, say, Wisconsin? What kinds of, I'm guessing just small rodents? There's no lemmings. What are they eating here?
Yeah, we do not have lemmings in Wisconsin. And a lot of them will focus in on similarly sized small rodents. So they'll eat a lot of mice, a lot of voles, rats in urban or suburban areas. But they have a surprisingly varied diet. They eat almost anything that moves. A lot of them eat more birds than you might expect. They're very, even though they're kind of robust and stocky, like I said, they are kind of long-winged and powerful flyers, and they have good maneuverability. And that allows them to chase down birds. So they'll eat a lot of pigeons. They'll eat a surprising number of ducks. They eat a lot of ducks, and that's why you often find them, or one of the reasons why you often find them near wetlands or near the Great Lakes shores, particularly these harbors that have open water and host waterfowl species. They'll eat weasels. They eat a lot of rabbits. They have a real muskrats. Another, almost anything that moves. They can take things almost the size of geese. So they're very, very good hunters, and that having kind of a diverse diet really opens up the variety of habitats that they can utilize. So that's why sometimes you find them in just pure farm fields, hunting maybe from a telephone pole or a hay bale. You might find them in wetland areas. You might find them along the coast of the Great Lakes. You will often find them, surprisingly, in semi-urban areas. Most of them are not overly familiar with people, obviously, especially these young birds. And so they end up in these urban areas hunting pigeons and, small rodents. So they do eat a wide variety of things. And in the breeding grounds, kind of an interesting tidbit, they're so cued in on the lemmings, a lot of these birds, that they eat large numbers of them. And it's been documented that they may eat up to 1,600 lemmings per year up there in the Arctic. So if you can imagine that sort of rodent control coming to Wisconsin, I think most people would welcome that quite heartily.
You mentioned that they're good hunters. How are they able to take down like a duck or one of those larger birds like that? What enables them to do that?
Well, what enables them is, in part, an element of surprise. Owls generally move very quietly. Their wings have special adaptations in the feathers. There's kind of serrations along the edge, and that acts as kind of a silencer. And so an owl, when it flies, you don't hear it. So that there's that element of surprise. They often will hunt under the cover of darkness. And so in the case of hunting larger waterfowl that aren't active at night, that kind of gives them another element of camouflage or surprise. And then as far as the impact or the kill itself, they have huge feet, large talons, very sharp, very powerful, and they use that to strike a blow, and usually that initial blow will injure the prey item, and then they can circle back around while still on the wing in many cases and pick up that prey item out of the water or wherever it may be, and then carry it off. In the case of the heaviest prey items, they might not be able to carry it off, and they'll just attempt to eat it on sight. Most of their smaller prey, they're going to swallow whole, but when you get things like ducks and larger birds, then they have to pick portions of it off because it's too big to swallow.
Do they ever hunt together? Are there any instances of them working together to obtain prey?
There's no evidence of that I'm aware of. Generally, they may roost kind of near each other, kind of hang out adjacent to each other, or take their resting periods within eyesight of another owl. But when it comes time to foraging, they're not known to work together. And generally, that's true for almost all birds of prey. They don't work collectively or cooperatively, and that's true for snowy owls too. And in general, they don't need to. They're very efficient on their own.
So for people who want to view these birds, do you have any tips for where they should go or where they should look to find them?
So knowing a little bit about the bird will help you maximize your chances. And so the first and foremost, you want to know the types of habitats. And we talked about some of that already. It's pretty diverse. But if I was going to go looking for one, at least right now, I would cue in on probably two main things. One is these harbors along the Great Lakes. So as the snowy owls are migrating, they don't want to be out over that open water for too long. And so they end up getting kind of funneled or concentrated along the shorelines, and they move down the shorelines. And as they do, they hit some of these harbors, like we were talking about, that often have good places to roost, like breakwalls or other structures that are free of disturbance, and also may provide that prey source. And so we've seen that all this fall and early winter so far along the Lake Michigan shore, all the way from Marinette to Oconto to Green Bay, along the Lake Michigan shore at Kewaunee, down through Manitowoc, Sheboygan, Port Washington, Milwaukee, Kenosha, Racine. All those harbors have had snowy owls, and sometimes even more than one. And some of them still do. And so as long as that water remains open, I would suggest taking a look there. The other is open field habitat. So go visit a place that has good open fields that are likely to host rodents. A lot of times our state wildlife areas or a national wildlife refuge like Horicon are good places for this. And really cue in on looking just about anywhere there. You can look on the ground, you can look on hay bales, you can look on the telephone poles, they'll sit on buildings. They really have a wide diversity of sites they'll sit on. The other thing I would suggest is the time of day. Now, snowy owls are known for being diurnal, active during the day. And obviously they have to be when they're in the Arctic and there's 24 hours of daylight for the summer. But when they come here in the winter, the majority of them, not all of them, but the majority of them are not active during the day. When you see them during the day, they're sitting, and they're visible because they're not roosting in dense groves of trees or in holes in trees or anything like that. They're sitting out in the open still, so you see them, but they often have their eyes closed. They're not moving around. That's their rest time. But then late afternoon is when they become active. So that last hour or two of daylight can really be the best time to look for kind of an owl that's up and visible and actively doing its thing in terms of foraging. Same can be true of dawn. So the birds will hunt kind of around those dawn and dusk periods quite a bit. So you can look in those areas as well. So overall, in a nutshell, you can really improve your chances by looking at kind of those low-level perches out in these open habitats around dawn or dusk, basically from now until the end of March. With that said, you don't have to wait until dawn or dusk. You can certainly go take a look and find a bird in the middle of the day as well.
Now, since these birds attract a lot of attention, do you have any tips for how to view them without adversely impacting the birds? I know that's something a lot of birders worry about.
Yeah, and rightfully so. A lot. Obviously, it's great that these birds generate a lot of excitement. They particularly generate a lot of excitement among people who aren't necessarily what I would call bird watchers. They get excited about them, and that's a really good thing. But at the same time, that can lead to pressure on these owls that negatively impacts them. So remember, these birds are down here in some cases because they had trouble finding food up north. So they're already kind of stressed from a lack of food there, as well as flying 1,000 miles over the boreal forest, which doesn't have a lot of those open areas that they like to hunt. And in other cases, we have a lot of juvenile birds, which are inexperienced, have never seen people before. They don't know kind of the threats around them, and they're subject to potential harm while they're here. So with those things in mind, you want to make sure you give them plenty of space to rest, conserve energy, and then, of course, to successfully forage for prey when they're out and about doing that. So some of the things you want to really look for is a bird that starts paying attention to you. These birds are semi-tame in general, and so you don't, just because you're within 100 feet isn't necessarily a bad thing automatically. Other birds, obviously, that would be. Every bird has a little bit different comfort zone. But when you know that you're causing a problem is when that bird is spending time paying attention to you. And so if it's looking at you a whole lot, then that means it's not resting like it should be, or it's not seeing that potential prey. Maybe while it was looking at you, a mouse ran by and it missed it because it was watching you. A lot of times owls will become more erect instead of being kind of robust and kind of rounded in shape when they are relaxed. When they get irritated or agitated by your presence, they kind of stretch out and become more vertical. The neck becomes longer. The eyes become more wide open. They might stand more upright. That's a sign that you're too close or something is bothering that bird. And then obviously if it flies away because you got too close, then you were too close. And by that point, it's a little bit too late. But the take home there is don't get too close again. Avoid approaching that owl again so that you're not pushing it along. Smartphones these days are problematic for a couple reasons. One is people can easily play bird calls off of their phone, and that can have negative impact on many species, including snowy owls, so don't play any audio recordings. In addition, everybody wants to get a photograph of the owl they see, and a smartphone is not the right equipment to get a good picture of a snowy owl. So you want to avoid trying to get too close with your phone. Some other considerations, I would recommend watching from a vehicle whenever you can, but park that vehicle safely and shut the engine off so that you don't affect the birds. A lot of times they are listening for prey, not just looking for prey. And so if your car is running, that can disturb that. We also want to be very ethical as it relates to private landowners, so avoid going onto private landowners' properties, and also to local landowners and residents, in that we don't want to be blocking roads by maybe a rural road and we think nobody's around and we park in the middle of the road and we end up causing problems. So these are all issues that have come up before, not only with snowy owls but with other species. And I think the big thing to remember for folks is maybe doing any one of these things I've mentioned one time isn't the biggest deal. But if you think about the next person coming along and doing it and then somebody else doing it after that, those cumulative effects, especially in high traffic areas, can really be problematic for these birds. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that we should not be feeding these owls. Even though we think we can help them by maybe releasing some mice or some other prey item to them, that can have some very unintended negative impacts. Most specifically, it can habituate the owls to people, and so they start to associate food with people. And with a big bird like that, a snowy owl, that can be a big problem for a variety of reasons, but one of which is the way that those birds may get lured to a roadside and subsequently become endangered by the potential for a vehicle collision, which is one of their primary mortality factors when they're here in Wisconsin for the winter months. And we've already had many killed by collisions with cars so far this year.
So it's safe to say that their biggest threat when they're in Wisconsin is from humans as opposed to some other natural predator?
Yes. Yeah, I think that is safe to say. I wouldn't say there's a statistically published study to document that, but anecdotally and through my experience and the experience of many others, human-caused impacts are the biggest negative effect on owls while they're here. Once they get here, if they can get through, if some do arrive stressed from the long flight here and maybe they're having trouble finding food because they're in a new place and they are inexperienced at hunting and those sorts of things, if they can get past that first week or two, then they generally do well through the winter aside from these other factors. And they are significant. So vehicle collisions are a big one. Electrocution is a big one because they will frequent these power poles or fly into power lines. Secondary poisoning from rodenticides is another issue. And so when we put out poisons for rodents and then the owl eats the rodents that have been ingesting that poison, then that in turn will kill the owls. So they face a variety of threats when they're here. And that's all the more reason why we should do everything we can to limit our additional stress that we put on them through viewing or photographing them. We need to give them the best chance of survival as possible.
So when these birds do show up in Wisconsin, how are the sightings documented and shared? And what kind of research is being done?
Yeah, good question. So if folks see a snowy owl, the best way to give that sighting some worthwhile meaning is to enter it onto a website called ebird.org, and that's an online bird reporting system. You can go on there and report your sightings of all birds, not just snowy owls, and you can also see what other folks are seeing. But in addition to that tracking of numbers, snowy owls have not been really very well studied to be honest. If you can imagine a bird that's all the way up in the Arctic for a good chunk of the year, there's not a lot of people up there, and so they've been kind of mysterious in a lot of ways, save for a few research projects. When they come down here in the winter, there's a few more opportunities for study. In the past, it's mostly been done through bird banding, where a licensed bander or trapper has caught the bird, taken some measurements, maybe assessed the age and the sex of the bird, and put a unique aluminum band around its leg, and that has a unique number on it, and if that bird is ever found again, dead or alive, then we can learn something about its movements or how old it is and things like that. So that's been going on for some time. In the past, there's kind of isolated studies that have looked at their behavior using satellite tracking technology, so put a transmitter on them, track them through the use of satellites. That's provided some baseline information, but has not been extensive across the U.S. by any means. Most recently, many folks have probably heard of a project called Project Snowstorm. And this is kind of a collaborative effort of a number of researchers. It kind of originated out of the East Coast with a few prominent researchers there, especially one from Massachusetts Audubon named Norm Smith, who has trapped hundreds and hundreds of snowy owls at Boston's Logan Airport and relocated them elsewhere. But him and many others have kind of said, you know what? These eruptions provide us an opportunity to learn more about this bird. We should take advantage of that. We're going to do that. And the effort is kind of multi-pronged. Its primary goal is to trap birds and put this really cutting-edge transmitter technology on the bird. So these transmitters, instead of talking with satellites and having a battery that dies out kind of on its own, instead the batteries are solar powered, so they collect solar energy and use that to power the transmitter. And then the information collected is transmitted via cell tower. So it's a cellular-based technology instead of satellite. So as long as that bird's in cell phone range or in cell range, it will transmit the data, all of its locations. And they're attached kind of on the back with a little kind of a harness that's made out of a Teflon ribbon that goes around their wings. It doesn't inhibit their flight. Just unbelievable detail collected. They can take location information as well as altitude information, so where the bird is latitudinally, longitudinally, and altitudinally, as short as every 30 seconds, 24 hours a day for many years at a time. So that project is tagging a handful of owls in a number of different states over the years. The project's about 5 years old now, and I believe they have tagged just over 50 snowy owls in 11 different states during that time. We can learn their movement patterns. How big of an area does an owl occupy? How long does it stay there? And they're finding some owls are homebodies. They kind of stick close. They might just use a few square miles, and other owls are flying hundreds of miles all over the place, real nomadic wanderers. One of the very first owls that Project Snowstorm tagged, they had tagged it in New Jersey or Delaware. They had tagged it. But they kept getting these signals out in the Atlantic. They soon discovered, because their transmitters have such accuracy, they soon discovered that the bird was spending its nights out on a buoy in the ocean, hunting the water birds out there. So really fascinating stuff with great detail that they're discovering. Even though when they leave cell range, the data cannot be transmitted back to the researcher, those transmitters are still collecting data when those birds are north. Then come the following year when they move south again, if they move south again, when they come back into cell range, all the data that's been collected over the previous summer or the previous time out of cell range is downloaded and transmitted, and it's kind of a treasure trove of data from the past summer to see where these birds go. So really, really fascinating. In Wisconsin, when the project first started back 2013 or 14, we had a few owls that were tagged. Those ones subsequently did not return in other years, so we didn't get additional data beyond the winter's worth. But it's kind of exciting this year. They are returning. In fact, by the time your listeners hear this, there may even be a few owls tagged here in the state of Wisconsin with transmitters through the Project Snowstorm. A number of organizations kindly donated funding to this effort. As a result, we could have 5 or 6 snowy owls tagged with transmitters through this project in Wisconsin this year, and it'll be real exciting to kind of follow their movements. And you can do that on the Snowstorm website. The projectsnowstorm.org has a link to all the owls that are tagged, and it takes you to maps of where the birds have been seen and been hanging out and what we're learning and so forth. I believe they have a 3-day time lag because they don't want to necessarily have live information on where the owls are and lead large numbers of people to there in real time.
You're a bird monitoring coordinator with the DNR. So can you tell me a little bit about that job and what that all entails? Because I'm sure it's more than just snowy owls.
Yeah, so bird monitoring is a very important component of conserving birds. My job is to ensure, not necessarily for every single bird, but for a large group of birds, make sure that we're doing that right. Make sure that we have good information on how populations are doing to the extent possible, and making sure that we're applying it in the best ways possible. And so my work has generally focused to date in large part on bird groups that have not been well monitored to date. So owls are a bird group that I have spent time in. I coordinate a statewide survey for owl species through our Wisconsin Bird Conservation Initiative. So if you go to wisconsinbirds.org, you could find out more information on the survey work. And from that survey, we're looking to monitor things like great horned owls and eastern screech owls and northern saw-whet owls and barred owls. But in addition to that, these snowy owls, when they have these eruptions like this, there's an opportunity for us to kind of, see what's going on, see how the eruptions are different from year to year, maybe use that as an index over time to see how their populations are changing. I could easily see, given the current declining trend in snowy owls, maybe 30 years from now, someone who's doing something the same way I'm doing now in terms of tracking these birds, or the way that eBird is collecting data and providing metrics on owl populations. I could easily see that, instead of, these big eruptions giving us 200 owls here in the state, maybe we end up with, a maximum of 75 or 100. And over time, those sorts of trends in the index may be some indication that there's problems with this species. And we already do have some of those, not from the monitoring information that I'm collecting, because that hasn't been over a long enough period of time, but more rigorous studies in the U.S. and as well as in Canada, as well as globally, suggest that snowy owls are declining somewhat steeply. A recent study put out through the North American Bird Conservation Initiative suggests a 64% decline in the U.S. and Canada since 1970. So that's definitely a cause for concern. Now, a caveat, we don't have really rock-solid information simply because of the difficulty in monitoring them, like I mentioned earlier. A group that's really considered the global authority on the status of the natural world and its species, known as the International Union for Conservation of Nature, or IUCN, they've just changed their ranking for snowy owl from least concern to vulnerable. And so that is a step down in their rating system as to the status. And that's based on these trends, as well as some more recent studies that suggest the global population may be a bit smaller than previously estimated. So earlier estimates had it in the ballpark of 200, 300,000 owls. Some more recent studies suggest that that number may actually be closer to the lower tens of thousands of owls. And if that's the case, then obviously we have some real cause for concern. We need to examine, what are the causal factors for this? Why are these birds declining over that time? And right now it's, hypothesis and conjecture, but leading the way is climate change. The impact of climate change on these Arctic systems, particularly on how it affects lemming populations, are of great concern. It's thought that climate change will have these kind of cascading effects that goes through the system, the ecosystem there. And with snowy owls being at the top, they're likely to have a lot of difficulties. In addition, here on the wintering grounds, these collisions that we discussed, and potentially in the long run, and to some degree already, habitat loss. And so human development will certainly take a toll on this species. So making sure we have, habitats like open wetlands, like grasslands, making sure we have these for snowy owls is an important thing we can do here on the wintering grounds.
How are the other owl species in Wisconsin doing?
Well, it kind of depends on what owl we're talking about. Great horned owls, they're a generalist species. They eat a wide variety of prey. They're doing just fine. Barred owls, they're doing pretty well in Wisconsin, as on the whole, our forests mature, particularly across the northern half of the state. Eastern screech owl from the southern half or southern two-thirds of Wisconsin, they tend to be somewhat tolerant of people, but also need their woodlands. Their populations seem to be doing okay. There's some evidence they may be declining in the core of their range, yet at the same time, that's a species that is expanding northward, presumably with the effects of climate change giving us more southern-like conditions here in northern Wisconsin. We do have two owl species of particular concern. One of them is the short-eared owl, and the other is the long-eared owl. The short-eared owl is a bird that very much needs large tracts of open grassland and wetland. We have lost a great deal of that habitat over the decades, and as a result, short-eared owl populations have declined in Wisconsin, especially as breeders. We still get a decent number of them in the wintertime when birds from the Canadian prairies come down. And then long-eared owls, they're a tough nut to crack. They are a kind of a mysterious bird, and as a result, we don't have really great data right now on long-eared owls and their status. However, long-eared owls are thought to be declining over the last few decades, and the reasons for that are not entirely clear. While it's always nice to know everything about everything, and that would certainly help us conserve these birds a lot more, long-eared owls are one that we don't have a super firm grip on, but we are attempting to learn more.
I assume you've gotten an opportunity to go out and see snowy owls in the wild. Can you tell me about what it was like to see your first one?
Yeah, I live in Ashland. I'm on the shore of Lake Superior. It's a very rare year when I don't get to see a snowy owl. In most years, I get to see multiple snowy owls. In some years, I get to see dozens of snowy owls. Yet I still never tire of them. I just find them to be a fascinating creature. For me, I obviously love their appearance. I love that they're here at a time of year when there's not a lot of other birds around, so you can give more individual attention to the ones that are here. But for me, it's really that connection with the Arctic that they bring that, for me, gets me most excited. I love the idea of wilderness, this untamed land in the north. And when a snowy owl comes here and I'm watching it, I know it was there. I know it came from that place, and in that sense, it connects me to that place in a way that I can't get otherwise. And that's true of other birds, too, and that's one of the great things I love about birding in general. But that's specifically true for snowy owls. So I remember growing up, seeing pictures in a magazine, and as a kid in southeast Pennsylvania where you don't get many snowy owls, it's like, oh, I'm probably never going to see one of those. And then I came to school here in Wisconsin, and I can vividly remember just walking downtown right in Ashland, which isn't a large downtown, but it's urban, and sitting up on top of a building in the darkness, lit by the city lights, there was this large white kind of blob of an owl sitting up there actively hunting in the middle of a cold and snowy Wisconsin winter. And it was one of the most exciting things I had experienced. And subsequently, I've gotten better views, I've gotten to hold them, and all these wonderful, wonderful things that have connected me with this fascinating bird. So yeah, I'll never forget seeing that one. And I've been fortunate to see a bunch since.
What's it like to witness these animals? What are they generally up to when you're viewing them?
Most of the time, they're just sitting. They spend a lot of the daylight hours, resting. So they found a good roost site, usually out of the wind. Maybe it's in the sun. So they spend a lot of time sitting, Even when they're sitting, though, they're often looking for prey, so they're moving their head back and forth. One of my favorite things is when they're just kind of moving their head around, they're kind of all tucked up, and then they might hear something, or they might catch a glimpse of some prey item, and you see their neck really extends. Because when a bird's at rest, its neck is in kind of an S shape. It's kind of tucked in. And with a snowy owl, that makes it look like it really doesn't have a neck. But in fact, they have kind of a long neck. And so when they see that prey item, they extend that neck up and they get real alert. Their eyes get wide open. And then they might start bobbing their head. So they're moving their head from side to side or up and down, and it kind of looks like a puppet in a little bit. And what they're doing there is trying to cue in on exactly where that sight or sound is coming from. They have ears that are asymmetric. And so the sound arrives to their ears at slightly different times. We couldn't discern it, but they can. And that's what helps them pinpoint the location of that prey. So when they're real active like that, it's exciting. When they become really active towards prey, and so you see one glide down off of a post, and they're trying to find that rodent, they throw their legs out forward, and you get to see those fully feathered legs all the way down over their feet and their toes. And it almost looks like a snowshoe hare's feet, except for the talons. It's really spectacular because now you're getting a glimpse of a portion of the bird that you didn't get to see before. In addition, when they hit that prey, often their wings are up to help with balance. And so their feet are extended out, their wings are stretched up, and they kind of look angelic in a way. They're really, really spectacular. Another really interesting thing is to witness interactions between them and other owls. And so sometimes I said they'll roost near each other or something, or they might have some sort of dispute over a territory. And when they are interacting with another owl, another snowy owl in particular, that can be pretty spectacular because the two might chase each other, do maneuver through the air and kind of do some acrobatics. But overall, majority of the time you see a snowy, it's going to be sitting. And that sounds boring, but it's not. It's still spectacular, and that's still one of those the great lures of that bird.
Thank you to Ryan for taking the time to share all that great information about snowies. If you're not already subscribing to the podcast, make sure to do so on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play. You can also stay in the loop about the pod by visiting wispod.com and following the show on Twitter at wispodcast and on Facebook at the Wisconsin Podcast. Cheers!